The book I'd written before this one was a novel about and called Watergate, and I don't know what it says about my character, but I never felt uncomfortable writing Nixon from the inside out, you know, what's called the close third person, technically third person narration, but very heavily overlaid with his diction, his thoughts, the way he would apprehend things. I was working on Reagan for maybe 2 weeks before I decided that that wasn't going to happen, and I completely got the Edmund Morris problem. You know, Edmund Morris, Reagan has defeated any number of biographers, not Bill, but he defeated Morris, who resorted to instances of fictionalization. He didn't know what to do with Reagan. There are brilliant passages in his book, but he sort of, in a way, threw up his hands. He was at it for many, many years. And I think the remoteness in Reagan, the warmly impersonal qualities of him, or the impersonality of his warmth, was very real. George Will, whom I know a little bit in Washington, he said to me, "Oh, I think this remoteness stuff is overblown." And he, of course, knew Reagan and Mrs. Reagan as, you know, personal friends. But he said, he was, you know, this sort of genial Irishman, and kind of what you see was what you got. And he said his story is he had one friend and he married her. And I thought, well, how normal is that? I mean, even Nixon had two friends, and he didn't marry them. And Mrs. Reagan, I mean, as Bill is saying, understood the unusual quality of their self-containment. But I think that he had, there were moments when I thought Reagan was preposterously silly. There were other moments when I thought he was very big and very deep. Sort of like the character in one of John Updike's Rabbit books in the 80s, who thinks about Reagan in this way, about that he seemed to know very little, but you know, like the old hedgehog versus the fox, he knew something very big. And I think one of the keys to Reagan is his film career. Now, that doesn't go as far back or as deep psychologically as what Bill is talking about, but you know, they asked him one time, how can an actor be president of the United States? And he replied, I don't see how anyone who wasn't an actor could do this job. And I think that his acting career had paid him tremendous dividends on the whole. It allowed him to imagine things, sometimes very sentimentally, sometimes in a very kind of cheap Hollywood way, but it enlarged him in a way. And just one quick story was, a lot of my book concerns the Reykjavik summit with Gorbachev, which at the time is perceived as a failure. They get very close to abolishing nuclear weapons, but then they decide, or Reagan decides really not to do it. It comes to grief over the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. But in the transcripts to the summit, which are in the National Security Archive in Washington, they're not really transcripts, but the note taker is taking very detailed notes, almost verbatim at points. And when they get to this climactic session, Reagan says to Gorbachev, 10 years from now, he says, we can come back here, bury the last nuclear weapon, and have a party for the whole world. And he says, I'll be a very old man at that time, and you'll come up to me and you'll say, Ron, is that you? And I'll say, Mikhail, it's good to see you. And he uses his first name, which has not been common in the summit. And I realized that he was seeing it as a movie. It was a kind of, you know, Ron and Mike save the world picture. And I think in that sense, if you look at him compared to Nixon, the geopolitical chess player, the tactician who studied up on the issues to an astonishingly greater degree than Reagan ever did, nonetheless, Nixon could not bring himself to a point where he could imagine a world without the Soviet Union. Yeah. Reagan actually could, and I think that made for the bigness of his presidency, and I think he learned that in Hollywood.